The morning of July 28, 1935, marked a moment that would forever change the course of aerial warfare. At Boeing Field in Seattle, test pilot Les Tower climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft that looked unlike anything the world had seen before. The Boeing Model 299, as it was officially designated, was massive for its time, 103 feet long, with a wingspan stretching over 74 feet. As the four Wright Cyclone engines roared to life, each producing 1,200 horsepower, a reporter from the Seattle Times watched in awe. Richard Williams couldn't help but exclaim, "Why, it's a flying fortress." Boeing's executives, standing nearby, immediately recognized the marketing gold in that spontaneous description and would trademark the name within weeks. The genesis of this remarkable aircraft actually began almost a year earlier, on August 16, 1934, when the United States Army Air Corps issued a seemingly impossible request to American aircraft manufacturers. They wanted a multi-engine bomber that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs between 1,000 and 2,000 miles at speeds, reaching 250 miles per hour. Boeing had exactly 8 days to decide whether to pursue this contract, and their engineers threw themselves into the challenge with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Drawing from their experience with the Model 247 civilian transport and the experimental Model 294 bomber, they designed, built, and flew their prototype in less than 1 year, a feat that even today seems almost impossible. What emerged from those frantic months of development was revolutionary. The B-17 represented a complete reimagining of what a bomber could be. Unlike the fabric-covered biplanes that still dominated military thinking, this was an all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear, powered gun turrets, and an advanced electrical system. It could fly at altitudes approaching 36,000 feet, far above what most fighters of the era could reach. But perhaps most importantly, it embodied a radical new philosophy of aerial warfare. The idea that a bomber could defend itself, fight its way to a target in broad daylight, drop its bombs with precision, and return home. The American military doctrine of the 1930s had been heavily influenced by Italian theorist Giulio Douhet, who argued that future wars would be won by bombers that could fly over enemy lines and destroy their ability to wage war. The British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had famously declared that the bomber will always get through, and the Americans were determined to prove him right. The B-17, with its then-secret Norden bombsight, was supposed to be that unstoppable bomber, but the path from prototype to combat aircraft was far from smooth. During a crucial demonstration flight on October 30, 1935, disaster struck. The Model 299 crashed at Wright Field in Ohio, killing 2 crew members. The investigation revealed a tragically simple cause. The pilots had forgotten to remove the control locks before takeoff. This accident cost Boeing the initial contract, which went instead to the Douglas B-18 Bolo. Yet the Army Air Corps had been so impressed by the B-17's performance that they exploited a legal loophole to order 13 YB-17s for further testing. This decision, made against significant political pressure, would prove to be one of the most important in American military history. One of the most significant early demonstrations of the B-17's capabilities came in 1937, when General Andrews decided to showcase American air power in a very public way. 3 B-17s, led by a young navigator named Curtis LeMay, who would later become one of the most influential figures in Air Force history, were sent to intercept the Italian ocean liner Rex 610 miles off the Atlantic coast. In an era before radar and GPS, finding a single ship in the vast Atlantic was considered nearly impossible. But LeMay and his B-17s found the Rex exactly where they calculated it would be, dropping a bomb of publicity photographs that made newspapers around the world. The message was clear. America could project power anywhere, anytime. When World War II erupted in Europe in September 1939, the United States had fewer than 200 B-17s in service. The aircraft was still evolving, with each new model incorporating lessons learned from combat reports filtering in from Europe. The B-17E model, which would become the first mass-produced version, addressed many of the vulnerabilities identified in earlier variants. Most significantly, it added a tail gunner position with twin .50 caliber machine guns, a Sperry ball turret on the belly, and additional guns in the nose. These modifications transformed the B-17 from a fast bomber that happened to have defensive armament into a genuine flying fortress. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, caught many B-17s on the ground, but it also triggered an industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had seen. Boeing's factories in Seattle went into overdrive, with workers laboring in 3 shifts around the clock. The company alone would eventually build 69 81 B-17s at Plant 2, while Douglas built 2995, and Lockheed subsidiary Vega added another 2750. By war's end, 12,731 flying fortresses had rolled off American assembly lines. The first B-17s arrived in England in the summer of 1942, flown by crews of the 8th Air Force who would soon become legendary. These young men, most barely out of their teens, were about to test the theory that daylight precision bombing could win the war. The British, who had already been bloodied in their own daylight raids and forced to switch to nighttime area bombing, watched with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. They knew what the Americans were about to face. The first combat mission came on August 17, 1942, exactly 1 year after the first B-17s arrived in England. 12 flying fortresses took off to bomb the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen, France. It was a modest beginning, with all aircraft returning safely, but it marked the start of what would become the most intensive strategic bombing campaign in history. What the crews didn't know was that their aircraft had already been closely studied by their enemies. The German reaction to the B-17 was complex and evolved dramatically over time. When Luftwaffe intelligence first received reports about the American 4-engine bomber, many officers dismissed it as propaganda. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, famously boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach German soil. Even when the first B-17s appeared over Europe, many German fighter pilots were confident. After all, they had swept the skies clear of British bombers in daylight, forcing the RAF to resort to night attacks. Why should these American bombers be any different? The answer came in October 1942, when the Luftwaffe finally got their hands on their first crashed B-17 to examine. The bomber had drifted out of formation after being damaged and was shot down over German territory. The wreckage was carefully transporting to Richlin, the Luftwaffe's experimental aircraft testing facility, where it was painstakingly reassembled. What happened next would fundamentally change German strategic thinking. Colonel Adolf Galland, who was already one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces and would later become general of fighter aircraft, was among the first senior officers to examine the reconstructed B-17. His assessment was sobering and prescient. It unites every possible advantage in one bomber, he reported. Firstly, heavy armor, secondly, enormous altitude, thirdly, colossal defensive armament, and fourthly, great speed. Coming from a man who had shot down dozens of Allied aircraft, this wasn't praise, it was a warning. The technical details that emerged from the examination were even more alarming for the Germans. The B-17's 11 machine gun positions were loaded with incendiary ammunition that the Germans hadn't encountered before. The armor plating was strategically placed to protect vital components and crew positions. Most worryingly, from another crashed B-17, they had recovered an almost intact Norden bombsight, though German intelligence had actually obtained the blueprints before the war through espionage. Seeing the actual device confirmed American bombing accuracy potential. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Luftwaffe and one of the most competent administrators in the German war machine, saw implications that went far beyond the technical specifications. After examining the crashed B-17, he had a heated confrontation with Goering. The Reichsmarschall told me that there is no cause for anxiety about the American aircraft, and that, 4-engine though they may be, We can contemplate future with equanimity, Milch recorded. I told him that I do not agree. Later that month, Milch's concerns became even more explicit. These are worries I just can't get over. We have got to accept that one day the enemy bombers attacking Germany will be flying at altitudes of 28,000 or 30,000 feet. But not everyone in the German High Command shared Milch's pessimism. Hans Jeskenek, Chief of General Staff in the Luftwaffe, remained optimistic, declaring, "We will fetch these four-engined bombers down just as quickly as the twin-engined ones, and the loss of a four-engined bomber means a much higher loss to the enemy." This division in German leadership, between those who recognized the existential threat the B-17 represented and those who maintained their confidence in German superiority, would hamper the Luftwaffe's response for crucial months. Meanwhile, the American bomber crews were learning harsh lessons about the reality of daylight bombing. The theory had been that formations of B-17s, flying in tight defensive boxes with interlocking fields of fire, could fight their way to any target and back. Each bomber's guns would protect not just itself, but its neighbors, creating an aerial phalanx that no fighter could penetrate. In practice, the German fighters proved far more determined and innovative than anyone had anticipated. In November 1942, a German fighter ace named Egon Mayer made a discovery that would revolutionize Luftwaffe tactics against the B-17. Flying his Focke-Wulf 190, Mayer had been frustrated by the defensive fire he encountered when attacking B-17 formations from behind or from the sides. The tail gunners, in particular, had proven devastatingly effective. German pilots had already developed a healthy respect for these positions, with one pilot famously describing attacking a B-17 formation from behind as like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. But Mayer noticed something crucial. The B-17's nose was relatively lightly defended, with only 4 forward-firing guns compared to the concentrated firepower covering the rear and sides. More importantly, a head-on attack would take the fighters straight at the cockpit, where the pilots sat with minimal armor protection. The tactic required extraordinary courage and skill. The combined closing speed of a B-17 formation and attacking fighters exceeded 500 miles per hour, giving pilots perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before collision. Mayer tested his theory personally, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. Within weeks, the head-on attack became standard Luftwaffe doctrine. The impact on American bomber losses was immediate and catastrophic. Formation after formation returned to England with shattered cockpits, dead pilots, and aircraft barely able to fly. The defensive formation that had seemed impregnable was suddenly vulnerable. The missions of 1943 would test the resolve of every man who flew in a B-17. John Luckadoo, a pilot with the 100th Bomb Group, nicknamed the Bloody 100th for their appalling losses, later calculated that his unit experienced a 400% turnover in the first 90 days of combat operations. Think about what that means. For every man who started, 4 replacements would be needed. Bomber crews were assigned a 25-mission tour of duty, after which they could return home. Most never made it past their 5th mission. The city of Bremen, known to the bomber crews as Flak City, became a name that could make veteran airmen shudder. The anti-aircraft defenses were so intense that one pilot memorably said, "The flak was so thick that if you put your wheels down, you could taxi on it." On October 8, 1943, when the 8th Air Force launched a major raid on Bremen's shipyards, the Germans unveiled a new level of determination. Normally, fighters would peel away when bombers entered the flak field around the target, not wanting to risk being shot down by their own anti-aircraft fire. But on this day, the German pilots pressed their attacks right through their own flak, so desperate were they to stop the bombers. Luckadoo, flying that day, witnessed something that would haunt him forever. He watched as a flight of FW-190s barreled into his squadron. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw this flight of FW-190s barreling into our squadron, aiming right for us. They kept coming, kept coming. They may have killed the pilot of the lead ship, or else he was so determined that he was going to take down a bomber that he flew into, impacted the ship that I was formed on. The German fighter and American bomber collided in midair, both aircraft disintegrating in a ball of fire. Luckadoo had to push his control stick forward violently, diving to avoid the falling wreckage that threatened to take him down too. By the end of that October 8 mission, the 8th Air Force had lost 30 bombers, 300 men either killed or captured. The 100th Bomb Group lost 17 of the 19 B-17s it had sent out. The 381st lost 7 of 18. Of the bombers that made it back, many carried wounded men in their bullet-riddled fuselages. The official after-action report noted 301 wounded among the returning aircraft. These weren't just statistics. Each number represented a young man who had left home to fight for freedom and democracy. But it was October 14, 1943, that would go down in history as Black Thursday, the second raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The Germans knew the Americans were coming. Their radar and intelligence networks gave them ample warning. When 291 flying fortresses crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe was ready with everything they had. What followed was aerial combat of an intensity and savagery that defied imagination. The German fighters had been equipped with new weapons specifically designed to destroy B-17s, heavy cannons, rockets, and even aerial bombs that could be dropped on the formations from above. Some twin-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt 110 had been modified into bomber destroyers, carrying batteries of cannons that could fire from beyond the range of the B-17's defensive guns. The Germans had studied the B-17 intensively and knew that it took at least 20 hits with 20 cannon shells to bring one down when attacking from the rear. But they had also learned where to aim. The wing routes where the fuel tanks were located, the cockpit where the pilots sat, the bomb bay where a single hit could trigger catastrophic explosions. As the bombers pressed deeper into Germany, the attacks intensified. American gunners fired until their guns jammed from overheating, then tried to clear them with frozen fingers at 25,000 feet, where the temperature could drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin air at altitude meant that even minor wounds could be fatal, as blood loss was accelerated and shock set in quickly. Men passed out from lack of oxygen when their masks were shot away, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes when heated suits failed. One B-17 radio operator later described the scene. Emergency hatches, exit doors, prematurely opened parachutes, bodies, and assorted fragments of B-17s and Hun fighters breezed past us in the slipstream. I watched two fighters explode not far beneath, disappearing in sheets of orange flame, B-17s dropping out in every state of distress, from engines on fire to control surfaces shot away. Friendly and enemy parachutes floating down, and on the green carpet far beneath us, numerous funeral pyres of smoke from fallen aircraft, marking our trail. Despite the carnage, the surviving bombers pressed on to Schweinfurt. Those that reached the target delivered their bombs with remarkable accuracy, severely damaging all three ball-bearing plants that were targeted. But the return journey became another gauntlet of horror. German fighters that had landed to refuel and rearm took off again, intercepting the battered bomber stream. By the time the survivors reached England, 60 B-17s had been shot down, 5 more crashed or crash-landed, and 12 others were damaged beyond repair. In one day, the 8th Air Force had lost over 600 men. The crisis was clear. The B-17, for all its defensive armament, couldn't survive without fighter escort deep into Germany. The Americans faced a terrible choice: abandon the daylight bombing campaign that was central to their strategy, or find a way to protect the bombers. The solution would come in the form of a single-engine fighter that could fly as far as the bombers, the North American P-51 Mustang. But until enough Mustangs arrived in Europe, the B-17 crews would continue to pay a terrible price. Yet even in these darkest days, stories emerged that showed the B-17's incredible toughness and the courage of the men who flew them. There were countless tales of flying fortresses returning to base with damage that should have been fatal. Huge holes blown in fuselages, entire engine assemblies shot away, control cables severed, tail sections nearly torn off. One B-17 famously returned with most of its nose shot away. The bombardier's compartment completely gone, yet somehow the pilots managed to fly it home. The Germans were astounded by what it took to bring down a B-17. One Luftwaffe pilot described his experience. The size of the heavy bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to a green pilot. They had to be experienced firsthand. The bomber gunners opened fire as soon as a target was seen in order to disrupt or ward off attacks. The Americans' Browning .50-inch machine guns had a higher muzzle velocity and a greater range than the Germans' MG-17s. So the fighter pilots' cockpits were surrounded by red tracers, swarming like wasps, long before they themselves could open fire effectively. The B-17 crews developed their own tactics to survive. The combat box formation became increasingly sophisticated, with high, low, and lead groups positioned to provide maximum defensive firepower. Pilots learned to fly so close together that their wingtips almost touched, making it harder for fighters to single out individual bombers. They developed the fighter weave maneuver, where bombers would take turns moving to the front of the formation to engage attacking fighters with their forward guns. But perhaps the most important factor in the B-17's effectiveness was the bond between crew members. 10 men flew in each flying fortress: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, top turret gunner, radio operator, 2 waist gunners, ball turret gunner, and tail gunner. These men trained together, flew together, and all too often died together. They came from every corner of America: farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York, college students and high school dropouts. In the crucible of combat, they became closer than brothers. The ball turret gunner had perhaps the most terrifying position in the aircraft. Suspended in a plexiglass and metal sphere beneath the bomber, he was completely isolated from the rest of the crew, unable to wear a parachute due to space constraints, and utterly dependent on the aircraft's hydraulic system to rotate his turret back to the escape position. There were horrifying instances where B-17s had to make belly landings with the ball turret gunner still trapped inside, unable to escape because the hydraulic system had been shot out. The rest of the crew would have to listen to his final words over the intercom, knowing there was nothing they could do. Despite the horrors, or perhaps because of them, acts of extraordinary heroism became commonplace. Gunners would stay at their positions even when wounded, continuing to fire at attacking fighters. Pilots would hold their crippled aircraft steady so their crews could bail out, sacrificing their own chances of escape. Flight engineers would crawl out onto the wings in flight to extinguish engine fires. These weren't professional warriors. They were ordinary young Americans who found extraordinary courage when their friends' lives depended on it. The spring of 1944 marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang, with external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, finally gave the Americans a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. General Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force, made a crucial tactical decision. Instead of having the fighters stay close to the bomber formations, he ordered them to range ahead and actively hunt German fighters. The bomber crews were upset, one fighter pilot recalled. The fighter pilots were ecstatic. Adolf Galland, by then General of Fighter Aircraft for the Luftwaffe, later identified this change in tactics as the moment Germany lost the air war. The Luftwaffe was forced to come up and fight not just over the targets, but everywhere along the bomber routes. German pilots, who had once been able to pick their moments to attack, now found themselves constantly engaged. Losses mounted rapidly, and more critically, experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The B-17 formations, now protected by swarms of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, pressed their attacks with renewed determination. The combined bomber offensive reached its crescendo in Big Week, in February 1944, when over 1,000 bombers attacked German aircraft factories in a coordinated campaign that effectively broke the back of the Luftwaffe's fighter production. Though losses were still heavy, the 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers that week. The Germans lost far more, including irreplaceable skilled workers and manufacturing capability. But the air war wasn't just about statistics and strategic objectives. It was about individual human experiences that defied comprehension. On December 20, 1943, one such moment occurred that would only come to light decades later. A B-17 nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, piloted by Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, had been severely damaged during a bomb run over Bremen. The aircraft had one engine completely destroyed, another failing, the nose blown open, the hydraulic system shot out, and most of the crew wounded. As Brown struggled to keep the dying bomber in the air, a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 pulled alongside. The German pilot was Franz Stigler, a veteran ace with 27 confirmed victories, just 3 short of qualifying for the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. Shooting down the helpless B-17 would have given him one of those victories. But as Stigler flew close to the bomber, he could see through the shattered fuselage. He saw wounded men lying on the floor, others trying desperately to help their injured crewmates. The bomber's guns hung limp and unmanned. To Stigler, the B-17 was no longer a war machine. It had become, in essence, a parachute for 10 helpless men. Stigler remembered the words of his mentor, Gustav Rodel, who had told him, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Making a decision that could have resulted in his court-martial and execution, Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the B-17's cockpit and tried to signal Brown to turn towards Sweden, where they could be interned safely. When Brown didn't understand, Stigler did something even more extraordinary. He escorted the crippled bomber through the German coastal defenses, preventing anti-aircraft batteries from firing on it. Only after they reached the North Sea did Stigler peel away, saluting the American crew before heading home. Brown managed to nurse his bomber back to England, where he made an emergency landing. Both pilots survived the war, but were ordered never to speak of the incident. Brown, because it might encourage American crews to trust German fighters, and Stigler, because he would have been executed for treason. It wasn't until 1986, after years of searching, that Brown finally found Stigler living in Canada. The two former enemies became close friends, dying within months of each other in 2008. Such moments of humanity were rare in the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. By early 1944, the life expectancy of a B-17 crew was measured in weeks. The bombers were striking deeper into Germany, hitting oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation networks. The Germans threw everything they had at the formations: conventional fighters, rocket-equipped interceptors, even experiments with ramming attacks by pilots willing to sacrifice themselves. But the tide had turned decisively. D-Day, June 6, 1944, saw every available B-17 in England take to the air. Instead of their usual strategic targets, they bombed German positions just behind the invasion beaches, transportation choke points, and communication centers. The cream of the Luftwaffe's fighter force had been drawn away to defend the Reich itself, leaving the German army in Normandy with virtually no air cover. The B-17s operated almost with impunity, a stunning reversal from just a year earlier when every mission had been a desperate battle for survival. Yet even as victory became increasingly certain, the cost remained high. The very characteristics that made the B-17 such an effective weapon, its ability to fly in tight formations at high altitude, also made it vulnerable to new German weapons. The introduction of jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me 262 in late 1944 gave the Germans an aircraft that could slash through bomber formations at speeds the escort fighters couldn't match. Surface-to-air missiles, though primitive, began to appear. The Germans even experimented with high-altitude balloon bombs designed to be dropped into bomber formations. The crews themselves were reaching the limits of human endurance. The combination of extreme cold, low oxygen, constant fear, and the trauma of seeing friends die day after day took a devastating psychological toll. Flak happy, became the term for airmen who had simply seen too much. Some men flew mission after mission in a near catatonic state, functioning on pure training and muscle memory. Others broke down completely, unable to board their aircraft without being physically ill. The flight surgeons did what they could, but there was no real treatment for what would later be recognized as severe PTSD. In the winter of 1944 to 45, the B-17s participated in some of the war's most controversial missions. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 saw hundreds of flying fortresses drop incendiary bombs on a city packed with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The resulting firestorm killed tens of thousands of civilians and raised questions about the morality of strategic bombing that persist to this day. For the B-17 crews, many of whom had enlisted to fight against fascism and defend democracy, these missions against essentially defenseless cities were deeply troubling. But the strategic bombing campaign also achieved undeniable results. By early 1945, German oil production had been reduced to a trickle. The Luftwaffe, though still possessing modern aircraft, lacked the fuel to fly them. Transportation networks were shattered, preventing the movement of troops and supplies. Industrial production, despite Albert Speer's organizational genius, couldn't keep pace with the losses inflicted by round-the-clock bombing. The B-17s, along with their B-24 Liberator cousins flying from Italy and the RAF's night bombers, had effectively destroyed Germany's ability to wage modern war. The last B-17 combat mission in Europe was flown on April 25, 1945, against an armaments factory in Czechoslovakia. By then, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Hitler would commit suicide 5 days later, and Germany would surrender unconditionally on May 8. The B-17s had dropped more bombs than any other American aircraft during the war, 640,000 and 36 tons of ordnance on European targets alone. But the cost had been staggering. The 8th Air Force alone lost 47 54 B-17s in combat, with over 40,000 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. In the Pacific Theater, B-17s had played a smaller but still significant role. They had been among the first to strike back at the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, conducting long-range reconnaissance and anti-shipping missions from bases in Australia and the Solomon Islands. But the vast distances of the Pacific and the B-17's relatively limited range, compared to the newer B-29 Superfortress, meant that it was gradually phased out of frontline service in that theater. As the war ended, most B-17s were quickly retired. The advent of jet aircraft and nuclear weapons had made them obsolete almost overnight. Thousands were flown to storage facilities in the American desert and scrapped, their aluminum recycled into peaceful products. Some found new life as cargo haulers, aerial firefighters, or research aircraft. A few were preserved as memorials, standing as silent testimony to the courage of the men who flew them. But the legacy of the B-17 extends far beyond its physical presence. It fundamentally changed how wars would be fought, proving that air power could be a decisive factor in modern conflict. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its moral complexities and terrible human cost, had demonstrated that industrial nations could be defeated by destroying their ability to produce the implements of war. This lesson would shape military doctrine for generations to come. The B-17 also changed America itself. The massive production effort required to build nearly 13,000 of these complex aircraft transformed the nation's industrial base. Factories that had built cars began building bombers. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, forever changing American society. The technological innovations developed for the B-17, from supercharged engines to advanced electronics, would find countless civilian applications in the post-war world. For the men who flew in B-17s, the experience marked them for life. Many could never speak about what they had seen and done. Others spent decades trying to make sense of their experiences, writing memoirs, attending reunions, searching for meaning in the chaos of war. The bonds formed in those freezing, terrifying bomber formations proved unbreakable. Decades after the war, Surviving crew members would travel across the country to attend a former crewmate's funeral, honoring promises made when they were all young men facing death together. General Karl Spaatz, who commanded the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, would later say simply, "Without the B-17, we might have lost the war." It's a stunning statement, but consider what the B-17 achieved. It forced Germany to devote enormous resources to air defense, resources that couldn't be used on the Eastern Front against the Soviets or in North Africa against the British. It destroyed the infrastructure that Germany needed to wage war. Most importantly, it proved that democratic nations, when threatened, could mobilize their industrial might and citizen soldiers to defeat totalitarianism. The story of how Luftwaffe aces went from mocking the B-17 to fearing it is really the story of how assumptions about warfare can be shattered by technological innovation and human courage. The German pilots who laughed at the Flying Fortress in 1942 weren't wrong to be confident. They were among the best trained, most experienced fighter pilots in the world, flying excellent aircraft. But they underestimated both the B-17 itself and, more importantly, the determination of the young Americans who flew them. Those young Americans weren't professional soldiers. They were boys who had grown up during the Great Depression, who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor out of patriotism and a sense of duty. They learned to fly the most complex aircraft of their era, to navigate over hostile territory using dead reckoning and celestial navigation, to drop bombs accurately from 5 miles up while being shot at, and to do it all while watching their friends die around them. They did this not because they were ordered to, but because they believed it was necessary to defeat fascism and preserve freedom. The transformation of the Luftwaffe's attitude toward the B-17 paralleled Germany's gradual realization that they had fundamentally miscalculated in starting World War II. The same hubris that led Hitler to believe he could conquer Europe led the Luftwaffe to believe they could easily sweep American bombers from the sky. By the time they understood their error, it was too late. The industrial might of America, symbolized by the endless streams of B-17s filling the German sky, had become an unstoppable force. Field Marshal Erhard Milch's prediction after examining that first crashed B-17 in 1942 had proven prophetic. "Things don't look rosy for our big cities," he had said. By 1945, most of Germany's cities lay in ruins, their destruction accomplished primarily by the bomber Milch had immediately recognized as a mortal threat. His March 1943 warning about that year being the year of clenched teeth had actually understated the reality. It was the beginning of Germany's complete aerial defeat. The individual stories of B-17 crews reveal the human dimension of this vast historical narrative. Take the story of Lieutenant William Lawley, Jr., who received the Medal of Honor for his actions on February 20, 1944. When his B-17 was attacked by 20 German fighters over Europe, his co-pilot was killed instantly, and Lawley was severely wounded, with his face and hands torn by shrapnel. The bomber's controls were shot away, one engine was on fire, and another was failing. Most of the crew was wounded, some critically. Lawley could have ordered the crew to bail out and saved himself. Instead, knowing that several of his men were too badly wounded to parachute, he chose to stay with the aircraft. For the next 2 hours, he flew the dying bomber with one hand while using the other to hold off the dead co-pilot's body, which was jamming the control column. Blood from his facial wounds had frozen over his eyes in the sub-zero temperature, effectively blinding him. His bombardier had to wipe the blood away repeatedly so Lawley could see. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to crash-land the B-17 in England, saving the lives of his wounded crewmates. When asked decades later about flying a B-17 again at an anniversary event, Lawley said, "I wouldn't say that it was emotional. It was a great thrill. They had us sit in the radio room and then invited us up front one at a time. I sat in the left seat and flew for a few minutes in formation. I did a slow 360-degree turn. It was great fun after all these years." This understated response, typical of B-17 veterans, barely hints at the depth of experience and trauma these men carried with them. Another Medal of Honor recipient, John C. Morgan, became famous for an incident that was later recreated in the movie 12 O'Clock High. On July 28, 1943, his B-17 was hit by a cannon shell that came through the windshield, splitting open the pilot's skull. The pilot, though mortally wounded and in a crazed state, fought Morgan for control of the aircraft. For 2 hours, Morgan flew in formation with one hand on the controls and the other holding off the dying pilot. He couldn't call for help because the intercom was destroyed. He couldn't leave the cockpit because the pilot would crash the plane. So he flew on, maintaining formation, completing the mission, and bringing his crew home. These individual acts of heroism were multiplied thousands of times over. Every B-17 that returned from a mission carried stories of courage that would never be fully told. Gunners who stayed at their positions even as frostbite took their fingers. Navigators who guided their formations home despite being blinded by wounds. Bombardiers who stayed focused on their targets even as flak burst around them. Engineers who repaired critical damage in flight, sometimes having to go outside the aircraft at 25,000 feet to do so. The B-17's influence extended beyond the men who flew them. On the home front, the aircraft became a symbol of American determination. War bond drives featured B-17s prominently. Cities and organizations would sponsor bombers with aircraft carrying names like the City of Seattle or the Spirit of Notre Dame. Workers in Boeing's factories took immense pride in their work, knowing that the quality of their craftsmanship could mean the difference between a crew coming home or not. They would sometimes hide notes of encouragement in the aircraft for the crews to find. The technological innovations driven by the B-17 program had lasting impacts. The development of high-altitude flight equipment led to advances in aviation medicine and eventually to space exploration technology. The mass production techniques pioneered in B-17 factories revolutionized American manufacturing. The navigation and bombing systems developed for the B-17 laid the groundwork for modern avionics. Even the organizational structures developed to manage the massive bomber operations influenced post-war corporate management theories. As we near the end of this story, it's important to address the moral complexities of strategic bombing. The B-17s and their crews were instruments of a campaign that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Cities with centuries of history were reduced to rubble. The debate over whether strategic bombing was necessary or effective continues among historians. Some argue it was essential to defeating Nazi Germany. Others contend it diverted resources from more effective uses and strengthened German resolve. What cannot be debated is the courage of the men who flew these missions. They didn't make the strategic decisions. They simply carried them out, knowing that each mission might be their last. They faced not just the immediate dangers of combat, but also the moral burden of their actions. Many veterans struggled with this burden for the rest of their lives, questioning whether what they had done was justified, even as they remained proud of their service. The story reaches its emotional crescendo when we consider what happened to these men after the war. They came home to a nation grateful for their service, but largely ignorant of what they had experienced. There were no programs to help them deal with their trauma, no recognition of PTSD, no counseling services. They were expected to simply resume their normal lives, to forget what they had seen and done. Most managed to do so, at least outwardly, building careers, raising families, contributing to their communities. But the memories never left them. In their final years, many B-17 veterans began to open up about their experiences. They formed associations, held reunions, and created museums to preserve the memory of what they had done. They wanted future generations to understand not the glory of war, but its terrible cost. They wanted people to know about the friends they had lost, the suffering they had witnessed, the fear they had overcome. Most of all, they wanted their sacrifice to mean something, to serve as a warning against the forces of tyranny and hatred that had made their war necessary. Today, only a handful of B-17s still fly, maintained at enormous expense by dedicated organizations that believe their story must not be forgotten. When these aircraft appear at air shows, elderly veterans often stand before them with tears in their eyes, remembering youth and friends long gone. Younger generations watch in awe, trying to imagine what it must have been like to fly into combat in these magnificent machines, facing death with each mission, yet going back again and again until the job was done or they could fly no more. The transformation of the B-17 from a mocked adversary to the Luftwaffe's nightmare represents more than just a chapter in military history. It embodies the triumph of democracy over fascism, of industrial might over military tradition, of citizen soldiers over professional warriors. It shows how free people, when threatened, can accomplish the extraordinary. The young Americans who flew B-17s didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as ordinary people doing what needed to be done. That, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. As we conclude this story, let's return to where we began, with those Luftwaffe officers examining the crashed B-17 in October 1942. They saw the technical specifications, the armor, the weapons. What they couldn't see was the determination of the democracy that had produced it and the courage of the young men who would fly it. They couldn't see the factories that would produce these bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. They couldn't see the training programs that would turn farm boys and store clerks into warriors of the air. Most of all, they couldn't see that they were looking at the instrument of their own defeat. The final, powerful emotional truth of the B-17 story isn't found in statistics or strategic assessments. It's found in a simple fact that emerged years after the war ended, when former Luftwaffe pilots and B-17 crew members began meeting at international aviation events in the 1970s and 1980s. Something remarkable happened. These men who had once tried to kill each other discovered they had more in common with their former enemies than with most of their own countrymen. They shared experiences that no one who hadn't been there could understand. They had all been young men doing their duty as they understood it, caught up in historical forces beyond their control. At one such gathering, an elderly Luftwaffe ace was asked what he thought when he saw B-17 formations approaching. His answer, given with tears in his eyes, captures the ultimate tragedy and waste of war. I thought of all the brave young men on both sides who were about to die. Another German pilot, speaking of the B-17 crews, said simply, "They were the bravest men I ever fought." These statements, from men who had every reason to hate their former enemies, reveal the profound respect that warriors have for each other, transcending nationality and ideology. The most poignant moment in our story comes from Franz Stigler, the German pilot who spared Charlie Brown's B-17. When asked years later why he didn't shoot down the helpless bomber, Stigler said, "I didn't have the heart to finish off those brave men. I flew beside them for a long time. They were trying desperately to get home, and I was going to let them do that. I could not have shot at them. It would have been the same as shooting at a man in a parachute." When Brown finally found Stigler in 1986, their first meeting was charged with emotion. Brown asked the question that had haunted him for decades. "Why didn't you shoot us down?" Stigler's answer was simple. "I didn't have the heart to finish those brave men. I saw you're wounded. I saw you were struggling to stay aloft. To me, it was already like you were in your parachutes." The two men became inseparable friends for the remaining years of their lives. They traveled together to veteran events, telling their story as a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion even in war's darkest moments. When Brown spoke of Stigler, he would say, "He gave me my life, and more importantly, he gave me the lives of my crew." How do you repay something like that? When Stigler died in March 2008, Brown was devastated. He died 8 months later, and many who knew them believed he died of a broken heart. This is how the story of the B-17 Flying Fortress ultimately ends, not with statistics about bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but with the recognition of shared humanity between former enemies. The aircraft that started as Boeing Model 299 became the Flying Fortress, turned into the Luftwaffe's nightmare, and ended as a symbol of American industrial might, ultimately represents something even more profound. It represents the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when history demands it. the ability of humanity to find compassion even in the midst of mechanized slaughter, and the hope that understanding between former enemies might prevent future wars. The boys who climbed into B-17s in 1943 and 1944, knowing that they likely wouldn't survive their tour of duty, didn't do so because they loved war. They did so because they believed they were fighting to end war, to defeat an evil that threatened everything they held dear. The German pilots who rose to meet them, equally brave, equally doomed, were caught in the same historical tragedy. Both sides showed incredible courage, suffered terrible losses, and left lessons that we ignore at our peril. When the last B-17 veteran passes away, and that day is rapidly approaching, we will lose the living connection to this remarkable story. But the story itself must endure, not as a glorification of war, but as a warning about its costs and a tribute to those who paid them. The transformation of the B-17 from a mocked adversary to a feared opponent to, ultimately, a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies encapsulates the entire arc of World War II and its aftermath. In the end, the most powerful emotion evoked by the B-17 story isn't pride in victory or satisfaction in technological superiority. It's grief. Grief for all those young men, American and German alike, who never came home. It's grief for the innocents lost, for the cities destroyed, for the families shattered. But it's also hope. Hope that the sacrifices made meant something, that the world learned from this catastrophe, that the courage shown by those young men flying in aluminum death traps 5 miles above the earth might inspire future generations to find better ways to resolve their differences. The B-17 Flying Fortress changed the world. It helped win a war against fascism. It proved the power of strategic bombing and American industrial might. But most importantly, it showed us the best and worst of humanity, the capacity for both terrible destruction and incredible courage, for both mechanized murder and individual compassion. The Luftwaffe aces who once mocked it came to fear it, and then, in the fullness of time, came to respect the men who flew it. That transformation, from mockery to fear to respect to, ultimately, understanding, is the real lesson of the B-17, and it's a lesson that resonates far beyond the realm of military history.